Hello, it's me. This is a video guide on how to create a 3D Earth in Blender 2.9. We'll be focusing mostly on quick hacks and best guesses to create something that looks decent rather than focusing on 100% photorealism with things like atmospheric scattering and all of that lovely stuff. The general process for what we'll do is find and bring in the textures that we need, then use those textures to apply a base Earth map with the colors that we need, then focus on the oceans and get some specular reflections on those. Then we'll move on to creating the dark side of the Earth and how to create light, city lights on the dark side. Then we'll move on to building out the clouds. Finally, we'll create a thin atmosphere to give us the blue sheen and reddish gold sunset colors on the edges. This video does assume that you are vaguely familiar with the shader editor. So if you are not, I will link to a short walkthrough on that should get you through the basics, because otherwise things might get a little bit complicated. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to open up a new Blender file. All right, so with Blender open up, delete the default cube if you have it, and make sure that you're in EEVEE. I'm going to be using EEVEE today. The same concepts apply for cycles, but just for speed, I'll be using EEVEE. Before we get started, let's find the textures that we want to use. Generally, a Google search for Earth HD textures should be enough to get you something. The specific textures that I use are from solarsystemscope.com/textures. I found these were pretty good for this tutorial. I believe NASA has some on their websites as well. This website is certainly not your only option, but if you want something that's quick and free, then works a treat. All right, I have my textures downloaded, so let's pop back over into Blender and get started. Our planet is going to be a simple UV sphere with a number of subdivisions applied. Let's add modifier. Yeah, that should be good. Actually, just 2. There we go. Make sure that you are shading smooth. And just to clarify, what I just did is my Blender keyboard layout is spacebar action search. This is from the old iterations of Blender, where spacebar brings up your global search menu. I find that more helpful than being play or whatever it is in the newer versions. Cool, so we have our first sphere. I'm going to rename that to be... And let's go ahead and add a material. So in the Materials tab, hit New, and call this material Earth Main. If you don't have it open already, go ahead and open a shader editor window. That will allow us to manipulate the materials of our sphere, which is what this is all about. For the rest of the session, I think I'm going to be in rendered mode, just so that we get instant feedback on the materials that we're creating. Because we're in EEVEE, it shouldn't be too much of a burden to be in rendered constantly. The first thing that I'm going to do is change the background, because it's currently this gray, drab nonsense. So I'm going to go into the World tab and just bring the strength of that background down to 0. Actually, you know what I'm going to do instead is create that noisy starfield background very quickly. I'm going to add a noise texture, add a color ramp. Nope. Feed the noise into the color. Whoops. Feed the color into the strength of the background. No, into the color of the background. Strength of 1. Pull the black clip all the way up quite a decent way on your color ramp, and then bump up the scale to about 5,000. And just play around with that until you have a nice starry background. Just to give us context for what we're doing. Alright, so back in Object with our sphere selected. Now we don't have any lights. So I'm going to create a sunlight, also known as a directional light. And I'm going to rotate this along the X by 90, just so that the light is coming from the side. All right, that's good enough for now, and I'm going to leave that for the moment. So now back in our Earth main texture, let's go ahead and bring in those images. We can do that by Shift-A to add search, press S for search, and then image texture. Bring that into color, and for the moment we don't have any images, so it's black. To bring in the textures, it's as simple as hitting open and finding where you downloaded your textures. And you can bring them all in at the same time by selecting them all, and then just hitting this little image drop-down menu to choose the one that you want. So we want the day map. Excellent, there we go. We've downloaded the Earth texture, and it looks like it maps great, so we don't have to scale the UVs or anything. So there, we're done. Great, we have an Earth in 3D. If you wanted to look a little bit more convincing than this, then continue watching. All right, so now that we have the color, let's bring in the normal. Normal maps, if you are unfamiliar with the term, are a way to add bumpy detail without adding extra geometry. So they change the sort of bumpiness of your surface. So let's go ahead and choose our normal map. But if we bring in the normal map color directly into normal, something weird is going to happen in that nothing actually works. We don't have any change to our surface. Between our image texture and the normal, we need to add another node called normal map. And this translates the color information coming in from our normal map to an actual normal map as Blender understands it. The other thing that we need to change is that in our image texture node, we need to change the color space from sRGB to non-color. And now that we've done that, we should be able to you stupid idiot. Okay, so I'm back. I have been struggling with this for a couple of minutes now. I've been changing things around and getting no response in my viewport. So I just wanted to bring this up in case you have been having similar issues. For some idiot reason, my node had duplicated on top of itself. So I was changing the values of the node that wasn't actually connected to anything. So that's quite embarrassing. Anyway, back to the normal maps. To reiterate what I was saying before, you need to bring in the normal map as a texture, change the color space to non-color, feed it through a normal map node into the normal of your BSDF texture, and then you'll start seeing bumpiness in your texture. Obviously we can change that around, add more, take it away. For now, let's leave this at 2, give us some nice hills and valleys. Great, okay, so we've added some bumpiness to our mountain ranges. Let's now focus on the oceans, or rather the specular in general. So getting these reflections. The land looks a little bit too reflective, and the oceans don't really look reflective enough. It's always good to work from a reference, so I have some Google image search results for Earth from space that'll just be toggling back to every now and then. So for now, we're going to try and focus on this, getting this sort of shininess in the ocean and removing it on the land. Fortunately, this texture map, this texture pack that we downloaded has a specular map, and if we look at the specular map directly into our output, for the most part it looks like the ocean is high specular and the land is very low specular. So here we have a nice way of separating what is land from what is water. And we will keep coming back to this a couple of times. Okay, so the first thing to do is just drag that specular map into specular, and there we go. We have something that's a little bit better than it was before. Our ocean is nice and specular. However, it's a little too bright for me at the moment, so I'm going to turn that down by adding a math node, and then changing that to multiply. bringing in a value of 0.1, for example. And now we've got a nice, pretty low diffuse shine on the ocean. It is a tiny little too flat for my liking. I want to break up the sheen a little bit. To do that, one thing that we can do is add to this normal map. What I want to do is add a little bit of bumpiness to the areas that are just ocean. So let's duplicate our specular. Oh, we don't have to duplicate it. We can actually just take the color and apply noise only to areas of high specularity. All right, so let's add a noise texture. And the noise texture, I don't want this noise to be based off the UV map. I want this to be based off the object coordinate. So I'm going to add a texture coordinate and drag in object. And what this means is that it's going to evaluate the noise based on the position of whichever pixel is evaluating, based on the coordinate space of that object. So let's just visualize what that means. So the object coordinate space, it looks like our object is rotated at the moment. Let's unrotate that. It means that values increase, red values increase along the x-axis of that object, green values increase along the y-axis of that object, and blue values increase along the z-axis of that object, as you can sort of see here. And that's different to the UV coordinates, which is the UV map wrapped around the object. UV map could be fine, except we would have this seam around the edge, around one of the edges, and I don't really want that. So I often use, when creating noise textures and noise maps and things like that, I often use the object coordinate space just to give us a bit more of a uniform distribution of noise across the object. Okay, let's bring that back. All right, so we have a noise texture. Let's just demonstrate what that noise texture looks like. So that's our noise texture based off object space, and this is the noise texture based off UV coordinates. So you see that there's some strange seams happening with the UV, but with the object, no seams at all. Excellent. Now we only want to apply this noise in places of high specularity. So let's add another math node of type multiply, and multiply by the specular map. So now we only have noise in the oceans, which is great. Then we want to take this grayscale map and convert it to a normal map. And the way that we can do that is using a bump node. So the difference between bump node and normal map is for when you have a texture already. So from a different program coming in, or if you've downloaded normal maps off the internet or whatever. Whereas a bump map is if you have a grayscale image that you want to turn into a height map. So now that we have a bump map, we can add it in to our normal map using the vector map maths node. And this has to be vector math because if you use the normal math node, it clamps it down to a single value. So the traditional math node here can only perform operations on single values, whereas vector math performs operations on vector values, so things with an x, y, and a z. So let's take the normal map and add the bump map that we just created. Then if we look at what we've got, that doesn't look right. Oh, my mistake. This doesn't look right because I brought in the value to the normal input rather than the height input. So when you're bringing in a value that you want to represent the height of a surface, so in this case our noise texture, we want to map our noise texture to the height of our ocean. Obviously the value coming in needs to go into height and not normal, like I put it in. Silly. All right, so to go over that again, we have a noise texture that's based off the object space coordinates of our object, being applied only to the specular map of our object, so only the place where the oceans are. being fed into a bump node so that we can get height normal data off of that, being then added on to our normal map of the object. One thing to note here is if we were to switch over to cycles, for some reason cycles is having a problem with this, but EEVEE doesn't. The normals here look incredibly different, and that is because we've added two normal maps together, ultimately resulting in something that is more than a normal. Funnily enough, the normal node, or the normal input, expects normalized values. So values that have a magnitude, vector values that have a magnitude of 1. And by adding two normal maps together, we now have a vector that is greater than 1. And I think that is what is causing all of this problem. We don't see it in EEVEE because I guess EEVEE normalizes those values, but in cycles, it's causing this problem. So we can fix this by going in and adding a vector math node and changing it from add to normalize. And now, whether we're in cycles or in EEVEE, we have the same output. Obviously, this is not the texture that we really want, so I'm going to tweak some of these values here. First of all, bump the scale up to something like 250 maybe? Okay, that's a nice bumpy texture that doesn't look too bumpy from far away. Then increase the detail, and very importantly, in the bump, turn down some of these strength settings. So from earlier, I think the strength should be 0.025 and the distance 0.1. Maybe that's a little too small. That's okay for now, but we will revisit this in just a moment. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if we look at our reference image, that's probably a little too high still, so 0.0. Yeah, that should do. We will revisit this in a hot second. One thing that I want to do is if we look at our reference image, for me, there's a sort of two-stage part of this. There's a more diffuse reflection that is very wide-spreading, and then there's this center hotspot. So what I want to do is add a tiny little bit of extra gloss just to create this center hotspot, which we don't really have at the moment. So the way that I'm going to do this is add another shader node called Glossy. And this is going to allow us to have a little bit more control over the exact look of our reflection over here. I want the same noise map that we applied to the base specular over here to be applied to the glossiness. I'm going to pull that bump into the normal of our gloss. Just reroute this so it looks a little bit neater. Our nodes are never going to be 100% neat. We just have to live with that. And then put an add shader node and add our gloss. We also need to make sure that the gloss is only applied to the water areas and not the land areas. So let's just copy this node at this point, bring it over. Ugh, gross. So we have our specular map here. We're going to create an RGB node, and then we're going to multiply the RGB by the specular map and bring that into the color. And that will be our second gloss layer. And we can do that by mixing the RGBs together. It's a little bit confusing terminology, but under mix, we can then change this to multiply. And that means that we can multiply A by B using a factor of 1. Bring that into color. And now our second gloss layer only applies to the water. It's also very intense at the moment, so we can use our RGB node here to play around with the intensity. But this is going to be our center, our sort of hotspot in the center. So I want the roughness to be pretty low here, but I also think that's a little bit too intense. I'm going to pull that down to something pretty low. Now that we have both of these layers, we can play around with the bump a little bit more. At the moment, it's a little too bumpy for my liking. Oh, and one thing I forgot to do is increase the distortion of the noise a little bit. That can break up some of this. Even though noise is not super uniform, bringing up the distortion breaks apart that uniformity a little bit more. That's interesting. That's quite nice. A low scale, but a high detail. Okay, that's what I think I'm going for. That's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. Like I said, simple hacks and quick best guesses. Okay, so we have something that's fine for our specular. And I might actually bring that down a little bit more and then make it slightly orange, just because that's slightly orange. We'll be fiddling with the color of the sun later, but for now, let's just add a slight tint of orange there. Great, now that we have our specular oceanic sort of aspect of this done, let's go ahead and move on to the night side of the world. So adding that night texture, the city lights texture on the night side of the planet. We could, if we wanted to, start playing around with this emission input here on the principal node, but this part of my node tree is already looking a little bit cluttered, so instead I'm going to do the same thing that I did here with the glossy and pull out the material, add a new, well, add an add shader node, and then create all of the emission effects that I want to do here using an emission node. So if we bring in the emission straight into the shader, then as you would expect, our whole planet gets a bit of a glow about it. And that's obviously not what we're going for. All right, what we want to do is determine which side of the planet is facing away from the light source and then apply the night map to only that side. The way that we're going to do that is using the texture coordinate node. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the object versus UV. Now, the object output of this node gives us information about the the object coordinate space, so the local space of this object. So if we go into local coordinate space and then show the gizmo for this object, you can see that our red value increases as we move up along X, our green value increases as we move up along Y, and our blue value increases as we move up along Z. And because we are in the object coordinate space, if we rotate the object, that still applies along the object's local X, Y, Z. So that's pretty useful because one thing that we can do is add a gradient texture, and this will add a gradient along the x-axis of that object. So now we have a gradient along this object, and no matter how we rotate the object, it will always, the gradient will always face along the object's x-axis. By default, the object that this object is referring to is the object that the material is applied to. But we can take this coordinate space from a different object. So if we choose the sun, now apparently it seems as though nothing's changed, but if we rotate the sphere, our light is still coming in from that direction of the sun. And if we rotate the sun, that is when our gradient starts to change. One thing that's a little bit of a problem, though, is that it looks to me as though the sun is coming in from the y-axis, but our gradient is applying along the x-axis. which means that if we were to bring us back to the shader, our night side of the planet is not on the actual correct side of the planet. The way that we can fix that is through a mapping node. And the mapping node is just a way for us to translate, rotate, and if we want to scale the coordinates that are coming in. So all I want to do here is scale around a certain axis. Intuitively, this would be the z-axis because that's the world up. But unfortunately, that is not correct because if we look at the sun, on the sun's local axis, y is pointing up, which means that here what we need to do is rotate the mapping y-axis, and that's how we can rotate this gradient that's coming in from the sun. Okay, minus 90. So you could try to remember what's global, what's local, and the way that all the different coordinate spaces are interacting, or you could just trial by error it. So I try the z doesn't work. Try the x doesn't work. I try the y does work. It's rotating around the axis of the planet. And it looks like minus 90 does the trick. And now, as we rotate the sun, we have this gradient extending from 0 to 1 on the other side of the planet, the side that's facing away from the sun. That's pretty cool. One thing to note is that the sun does need to be in the center of the planet. So if we start to move the sun around, the gradient is going to follow the location of the sun. So it is important that your sun is in the center. If for some reason you don't want your sun in the center, so it's really important that your sun is way out to the side over there, maybe you're not using a directional light, but a point light instead, then what I suggest you do is create an empty in the center. Oh, why are you over there? Create an empty in the center of your world. Parent whatever light let's increase the size of that just so that I can select it. Parent the sun to that empty, and then and then you can move the sun all the way back or whatever. And then rather than basing the coordinate space off the sun object, base it off the empty. And then you would have to obviously fiddle around with where that's applied with the rotations because you've changed the rotating object. But yeah, don't worry about this too much right now. I'm just going to undo all of those. That's all to say you do have options. You're not obviously you're not limited to only the sun. You can paste this object coordinate space off any object in your scene, which is super handy. Okay, so now I have the gradient texture coming in to my emission node and then adding to my world shader. The last step of this process is to take our image texture of the night map. Ugh, stupid autocomplete nodes. And then mix RGB. We're going to multiply. Oops, we're going to multiply the texture that's coming in by the gradient texture that we've just created. And just make a factor of 1 once Blender's caught up with me. Great, so now we have a planet where as the sun, let's select the sun, as the sun rotates around the planet, the daylight side gets light and everyone, like responsible adults, turns off their lights. And as we get dark, the lights turn on. Hooray! One thing that I notice is that the sun, the nighttime map that's coming in isn't completely black in the dark areas. It seems like there's a little bit of blueness here. And what that means is that we have this strange, very faint band of pure black between the blue daytime and the slightly blue nighttime. So I'm going to try and get rid of that by adding an RGB Curves node just after the texture, just after the image texture. and adding a couple of control points in here and just pulling down the darker areas. Obviously it changes the color of the midtones as well, so we have to be a little bit careful about this, but that seems to do the trick. And now we have a relatively uniform dark side of the planet. Fantastic. Great, so that's pretty much it for the base color of the planet. Obviously there's a lot of tweaking that we can do with these values to change the specularity of the ocean, to change the color of the world, but I'm not going to worry too much about that right now, because now I want to move on and focus on the clouds. So to create a cloud layer, I'm going to duplicate, Shift D, the planet, and then scale it, hit enter, scale it by some really tiny amount, 1.05? No, that's too much, 1.01. I think in the test I went 0.05. But for now, let's just go 1.01 and adjust later if necessary. You could, if you were really intense about it, figure out how high clouds are based on the circumference, based on the radius of the Earth, and then scale your cloud layer based on that. But like I said, this is just best guessing and quick hacks. All right, so with our duplicated layer selected, I'm going to rename this to Earth Clouds, go into the material layer and delete or remove that material, hit new, create Earth Clouds material. Right off the bat, we know that our clouds are going to be some sort of transparent. So alpha blend, alpha hashed, one of these. I'm going to choose alpha blend, and I'm going to remove the shadows. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way of getting compelling cloud shadows, or at least not that I found. So if clouds are really important to you, if the shadows of clouds are really important to you, use cycles instead of EEVEE, which is going to sacrifice the cloud shadows right now in the interest of speed. With our blend mode set to alpha blend, let's go over and create an image texture node and select our cloud layer. So that's going to be Earth Clouds. If we look at the image that's coming in, if we take the color of this image, drag it directly into surface, that looks like our cloud layer. Excellent, it looks great. Some weird stuff happening near the top, but we're not going to worry about that just at the moment. And let's see if there's an alpha. So bring the alpha into surface, and no, it looks like the image has a uniform alpha value of 1, which means that we can't drag the alpha into our alpha. So instead I'm going to drag the color into the alpha and set my base color to pure white, and that should be relatively good enough for the moment. Great, so we have some clouds coming in, and we can start playing around, if you really wanted to, increasing the value of the base color to get more intense clouds. And the other thing that we might want to do is play around a little bit with the specular and roughness. So I want my clouds to be pretty shiny, so high specular, low roughness. Great. And that's good enough for government work, but I want to do one more thing that might help sell the clouds a tiny little bit more. And that is, if we look at our reference images, clouds at sunset get a little bit of an orangey reddish tint to them. And anybody who's seen clouds at a sunset from the Earth will know this. But the thing is, this also happens in space. So yeah, if we look at some of these reference images, because of the way that light scatters through the atmosphere, when there is more atmosphere, light turns more red, and thus at the areas where there is more atmosphere to pass through, so the sort of the perpendicular edges to the light, or to the direction that the light's coming in, there's going to be a slightly redder hue. So I'm going to try and recreate that without going through all the hassle of setting up volumetric scattering. To do this, we can use the same technique that we did earlier to separate the dark and the light side of the planet. What I mean by that is if we go back into our main shader and we take a look at the gradient texture that we set up earlier, we have a gradient that extends from 0 to 1 along this side of the planet. But if we flip that round, then we would have a gradient from 0 to 1. And we can also change the position of that gradient. So we can extend it a little bit beyond the horizon line or a little bit before the horizon line. So that's what we're going to use to create a little bit of a reddish orange hue at this. It's not a horizon line, sorry, this terminator or whatever it's called. I'm going to copy those 3 nodes, go back into Earth Cloud and paste them over here. Where did they paste? No, they did not. Ooh, they're all the way over there. Okay, so I think the way that I want to do this is bring in, first of all, see what this looks like in this shader. Nothing unexpected, it's exactly the same. But I'm going to flip it around by changing -90 to 90. And I want this to extend a little bit after the terminator line, right? So wrap a little bit around the planet. Great, so as I change the location along the x-axis, then we get a little bit of a wrap. Great. So now what I want to do is set up a color gradient based on this grayscale gradient. And an easy way to do that is to use the color ramp node. So the color ramp node allows us to go in here and start adding colors along this scale of 0 to 1. Okay, so we've got a little bit, so we've got a, that's probably a little too intense. You know what? I think my sun is a little low. I'm going to increase the strength of the sun to 2. All right. So there we have the effect. It's quite subtle at the moment, which is probably a good thing. We don't want to be too ham-fisted with it. But essentially what's happening is as the sun, or in the areas where the sun is most perpendicular to the Earth, so where if we were using volumetrics, the sun rays would have to go the furthest, we have a little bit of an orange-reddish shift. And I think that's fine for now. We can always come back and change it later. And because we're using the sun's coordinates as we rotate the sun, that effect follows that rotation. Great. Let's pull down. Ooh, that's interesting. Okay, so we can change the specular of the sun as well if our global specular is a little bit too high. I think that sunspot there is just a little too much for me. So let's go back into the Earth main and pull down this glossy even more. Yeah, that should do it. All right, as you can see, there's a little bit of separation between the clouds and the Earth. If you like that, you can keep it, but like I said, it's a little too high for me, so I'm going to change this to 1.005. And yeah, it'll do. Fantastic. So the final thing that we're going to do is add a little bit of atmospheric effects, a tiny layer of atmosphere. So let's duplicate our Earth one more time, rename this Earth Atmo. Ooh, my caps lock is on. and once again remove the current material and create a new material called Atmo, or Earth Atmo, or for consistency's sake. Again, this is going to be a transparent material, so change our blend mode from blend to alpha blend. And I do not want any shadows. Scale it up to be 1.01, or whatever you want, as long as it's a little bit bigger than the clouds. And then let's go ahead and open that shader. Okay, there's two things that I want this atmosphere to do. The first is give us a bit of a blue sheen around the edge. For instance, kind of like this that you see in this reference image. Or this is another example. And then the second thing that I want this to do is sort of pseudo-replicate a little bit of that atmospheric scattering that we were talking about earlier. So around the edges, instead of a uniform blue, we get a little bit more of those sunset reds and oranges where the light has to travel further through the atmosphere. The first node that's going to come in helpful here is called a Fresnel node. What the Fresnel node does is give us information about the directionality of the polygons that we are looking at. So faces that are facing directly towards the camera are darker in this Fresnel node, and faces that are more perpendicular to the direction of the camera are brighter. And this index of refraction gives us a power curve adjustment there. So 1.45 is the default. That's what I'm going to stick with for the moment. Let's add this Fresnel into alpha and then take that out into BSDF. So immediately what that does is creates this brighter area, or on this specific shader, brighter areas around the edges and darker areas around the inside, which is great. We can change the base color to something that's a little bit more bluish, and now we have that sheen, or something that's sort of like that sheen around the edges of the planet. And what's nice about this is that as we rotate around the planet, we get this relatively nice crescent that we wouldn't have without the atmospheric shader. Okay, so that's it for the sheen. I don't know if sheen is the right word, but that's what I'm running with. That's all well and good, and it looks pretty okay, but the discerning amongst you might notice that there's some weird artifacts happening right at the edges. I think this might be something to do with EEVEE, but I'm not entirely sure. But around the edges of this transparent material, something weird is going on, and we're getting these really hard, sharp, dark edges. One way to fix that, or at least the way that I found, is to go into your material settings and under Show Backface, uncheck Show Backface, and that cleans up the edges a little bit. I think there's something to do with the double rendering of the transparent material that was causing some issues. So that gives us a much nicer edge to our atmosphere. Great, so now we've got a sort of basic atmospheric sheen going. I want to tweak this a little bit because there seems to be some specularity and bounce going on. Yeah, that you can see there. So what I want to do is try to get an effect where when we are at a pretty incidental angle, if that's the right way of describing it, then our specular is high and we have a nice little sort of glow on the atmosphere. But then when we are perpendicular, our specular is low and we don't see any reflection, which you can see at the moment adding to our reflections over there, which we don't really want. So the way that I'm going to do that is turn down the specular and roughness there, or actually turn up the roughness all the way. Create an add shader, and then just add some glossiness to this. Atmosphere. Obviously, that is not what we want. So what I'm going to do here is use the Fresnel node again to create high gloss when the Fresnel is high, and then low gloss where the Fresnel output is low. Bring that into color, I think. And actually what I want to do is color this reflection a little bit. I want it to be a bluish glow, as you see here. So we're going to multiply the Fresnel by a certain blue color and decrease the roughness quite a bit. Oh, it's not mix, it's multiply. That should do it. Okay, that's slightly better, but we still have some of this reflection here, and that's because if we look at the Fresnel node output directly, it's not completely black in the center, unless we were to tweak this value a little bit. Just for extra control, I'm going to put in a math node and use the power operator. That way we can really get fine control over how the gradient of this Fresnel works. I think that should do it. There we go. Okay, so we have no reflection, or at least no blue reflection when we are sort of coming in from the same angle as the light, and then as we rotate around the planet, we get more of a bluish glow. And we could tweak this forever and ever and ever, but that's good enough for now. Excellent. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do here is have that reddish hue shift towards the edges. So again, we're going to be using a Fresnel node, and we're going to use that same technique as we did with the clouds from earlier. So let's take these nodes that we built in the clouds, bring them over to the atmospheric shader. Where did they go? Just to reiterate one more time what's happening here, we are bringing in the texture coordinates based on the sun's rotation and position, then tweaking that so that it lines up with the dark side of our planet, and then adding a gradient texture so that we have values from 0 in the middle-ish of the planet to 1 at the place on the sun-facing side. And then we're adding a color ramp to give us our hue-ish orange and red shifts towards the edges. So let's see what that looks like. The one thing that I think I'm going to do is change the high from white to black, which means that now we just have a red and orange band through the center of our planet. I think I'll bring this a little bit further towards the dark side of the planet. And the reason that I'm doing this is so that I can add this as an emission to our atmospheric shader, so that the light sort of wraps around the edges further than the terminator line of the planet, of the sun. What I mean by that is let's add an add shader and an emission node. Take that emission, add it in on top of the original atmospheric shader onto the surface. And that looks terrible. Even if we bring down the values a little bit, that just looks so bad. We might want to blend it and fade it in a little bit, but it's just terrible. But the idea is there. So the idea is that as the sun light bends around the planet, the light goes from pure white to golden to red. To make it look a little bit better, we're going to bring in the Fresnel node again, so that the light only applies to the edges of the planet. So let's go ahead and mix RGB. We're going to multiply by this Fresnel coming in, a factor of 1. That looks slightly better. but the gradient isn't high enough, so I'm going to add a math node with a power operation and bring that up a little bit. Finally, we're going to change the amount that this emission is applied. And I think I overdid it on the amount of wrap. So let's bring this back to maybe 0.3. Okay. Really just make this emission very, very low, very subtle effect. Okay. No, that's still way too much. Nope, nope, nope. What would happen? You know, I think I might need to move these, to switch these two around, because right now we have the color gradient applying only on the gradient texture. But what happens if I apply the color gradient to the wrap as well? Okay, that looks a little bit better, and it's a very subtle difference, but if we look, just to show you what's going through my mind at the moment. Previously, we were applying the color ramp to just the gradient texture, which means that we have a uniform black to red to orange. So that looked like this. So we have this uniform, and then we just change the brightness of this based on that Fresnel. But what we're doing now, if I delete that, is changing the color gradient based on that Fresnel as well. So we have a little bit more of a natural wrap around the edges. So the gradient applies to the curve as well. And I think that looks a little bit better when applied back into, yeah. There we go. That's nicer. Okay, and that's pretty much it. We can start to enhance this look by adding in a little bit of EEVEE's bloom, increasing the intensity of that bloom to something more useful, like 0.25. Maybe we want to even add some orange to the bloom, because why not? Oh, I did say that I wanted to change the sunlight as well. Add a little bit of warmth to it. That might be a little too much. It is a blue planet after all. I think the power of this is too much. Ooh. Okay. Ah, no, that's terrible. Well, anyway, these values are there now for you to tweak as you wish. So, there we go. You might want to tweak with the values to get the exact look that you're going for, but for the most part, that's the general overview of creating this 3D Earth in Blender. Let's go ahead and just finish out the context of this by adding a sun. So I'm going to create a circle, go into edit mode, fill the circle, rotate around X by 90, then move it along the Y-axis a little bit, add a material called sun emission, and delete the principal, add emission. Let's turn this slightly yellowish. And then parent this to the sun. So we want to parent the object to the sun so that when we rotate the sun, the object will move with it. Push that quite a way back. But if you have a look, it seems to be casting a shadow. So under the material settings, turn shadow mode to none. Now it doesn't cast that shadow. Move that way back. Way back. Astronomically far back. And increase the strength quite a bit so that we have that nice little bloom to it. Because, you know, there's no such thing as overusing bloom. Why is it red? I don't want it to be red. I want it to be orange. Yellow. Yellow sun. That's what we have. I think my bloom is too intense. I know, I don't believe I said that as well. Yeah. There we go. Right, and now as we rotate the sun, light, our sun object rotates with it. And there you have it. I think that's all for now. So please let me know if this helped you or if you have... Oh, that's nice. Wow. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but it looks pretty cool. Okay, I could do this all day, so I'm going to let you go now. Please let me know if this was helpful, if anything was unclear, and what you might like to see next. All right, take care. Just take a breath. Here we go.